Hey everyone, so I have a little bit of a different video for you today. I am bringing in something a little bit new. This feels really exciting and it's an interesting format. So this is coming through as a little bit of like, it's giving a little bit of like a Q&A, but it's also a little bit of a channeling and a little bit of a personal anecdote. And I'm just like experimenting with this format because rather than coming in with like a single kind of like scripted lesson, for example, that I might want to share with you, I am kind of like playing with these energies as they're coming in because I know that you're going to be hearing the things that you need to hear anyway. And I'm just trusting this process because there's a lot of interesting stuff that really wants to come through in this. So, for example, I'm getting some material in now about like timelines and our manifestations, as well as specifically around this theme of the ways in which we encounter repetition in our own lives and the ways that we talk about that. I want to share with you a little bit about the best film that I've seen in quite a while. And it's probably, even from my own perspective, I wouldn't probably normally think of it in that way. But from the spiritual perspective, from the perspective of the things that we want to do for our own personal growth and evolution, absolutely, absolutely right up there. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. And yeah, and then just a little bit too about like tuning into collective energies and how that relates to our manifestations as well. So let's see how I do because there's kind of a lot in here, a lot of little nuances. And so what I want you to do also is to allow yourself to sit with a little bit of mystery for a little bit longer than you normally would. So, because this is how we get beyond what's obvious, right? And you've heard me talk about the obvious before. The obvious is literally like it comes from the verb to obviate, right? So there's literally a block in your perception. So it's funny that we think about what's obvious as being clear, but it actually means that there's a block. And what we're doing is just kind of perceiving the block. And it may be a heuristic, a psychological heuristic that we use. And it's just really a place where we haven't ever really dug deeper. Now, there's a really common teaching that is not altogether false, but we hear it a lot, and it kind of falls under this place of like what comes to feel really obvious, so that we kind of stop questioning it. And so you will often hear in many kinds of spiritual conversations, mystical conversations, that we're often repeating a pattern until we learn the lesson, and then we kind of like we no longer experience that as a pattern, or we kind of it dissolves or something happens, right? And then there's no more repetition. And there's just a lot going on in there. There's so much going on in there. There's so many registers to that like I'm still pulling it apart, right? But the thing in here is that not all repetitions are patterns, and not all patterns that you experience are necessarily habits or unconscious. There's more going on with repetition than just like a really stubborn place, like you haven't really learned something yet, and so you're just repeating it. Like there's more going on with repetition. And this is where I'm really intuiting that it can start to link up with our different timelines or different lifetimes, that whether this is, we conceive this as being in kind of a parallel simultaneity, or whether we see it kind of linearly as a past life, a future life. But there are other kinds of experiences that I think we should consider under this umbrella of like repetition. What repeats for you? So we have all kinds of these experiences, right? We have different types of feeling resonance with something. We have synchronicities. We have things that come in as very singular signs. Like we will just hear or feel or see them as very directed signs or very directed messages. We have these experiences of deja vu, and then we may have other kinds of nondescript kinds of like sensations or feelings or hunches or nudges, or and it's like not quite specific yet, but it's kind of maybe pointing us in one direction instead of another, or slowing down our speed, or nudging us to increase our speed, very basic things like that. But let's just think about this part where we often imagine repetition. We link it, right? We link it with being a pattern. We link pattern with being a habit, and therefore unconscious. This is not a necessary logical chain, right? Like none of these have to imply the other. So let's think about conscious modes of repetition, right? For example, and there's something extremely fascinating in this. So a metaphor that's always resonated with me, it's not a metaphor, but imagine, by the time you go to listen to like whatever, the Boston Symphony Orchestra, by the time you're there, like everyone who is there in the orchestra, they have played this concerto already like hundreds and hundreds of times. Like the pianist has played the piano concerto like maybe it's I don't know, maybe it's even more than 1,000 of times. Like it's a lot. It's a lot, even so individually and collectively as the orchestra in practice, rehearsal. So, do you think that is not unconscious? Those are not unconscious modes of repetition. They are so having committing things to like muscle memory and kind of like an emotional memory and this kind of instantaneous cognitive memory so that like there's a difference between having to do like explicit real time like metacognition versus real time conscious processing. So there's a spectrum, right? It's not like conscious unconscious, right? There aren't just two levels. There's implicit consciousness, there's implicit cognition, and that's not yet truly unconscious. And then there's subconscious, so there's like cold storage, right? Archival storage. There's also metacognition, which is like running on top of whatever you're already conscious of. So we need to understand these layers, and there's a little bit more nuance in there even so. So repetition alone is not necessarily about something being so unconscious or something that is not part of you and you need to release, or something that is a place where you're stubborn or you're not understanding. There's more going on. There's other dimensions of repetition. And here it also really links in with our theories about evolution. We understand the dominant theory of evolution because it's been tested and it explains a lot. That doesn't mean it's like the end of the story. For sure, it's not. But, even in that paradigm for how evolution works, going through different iterations, testing out various kinds of accidents and seeing like which choices kind of perform better, there's still an element of repetition in that too, right? So evolution doesn't just kind of dogmatically mean that now everything is just completely new, like you're a new version, and anything which is like old has just been discontinued. Like it doesn't work like that, right? Like there's always like these layers, these sediments, like many things are being repeated because they worked. And the other thing we commonly, I think when we hear these dominant discussions of repetition and like learning a lesson is that we do tend to place it in this kind of linear framework. But what if we take like a more, like, I'm not saying that's wrong, but like just as, Newtonian physics is not wrong, it's just not complete, right? We've added on to it. So what if we also take an expansive view on the nature of this kind of repetition and try to understand it within some theory of like parallel lives, simultaneous timelines in this infinite state space of truth. And if you do have other versions of yourself working through their own lessons and learning at the same time, simultaneously, we can play around the ideas that like these synchronicities, these deja vus, these like forms of resonance and direct messages, the one is the all is the one, right? So we are talking to ourselves in this way. These are kind of like bleed throughs from these other so-called timelines. I'm already gonna amend that. And parallel lives, simultaneous lives. At least there is definitely an aspect of extending ourself beyond just this minuscule, like momentary 3D experience, even if we're not yet talking about like fully other lives. But we extend, right? We've got an energy field that extends beyond ourselves. And so it's tapping into these other angles on our own, this specific incarnation anyway. And so even if we're taking just that kind of I can call it a limited view on the extension of our energy field, because we're not yet making the posit about I'm in three different timelines right now, or I'm in three simultaneous lives right now. Even if we don't metaphysically go to that step yet, we can still talk about our expanded energy form. And and it's legitimate to suppose that it's possible that our awareness extends beyond obviously just our momentary, this linear moment that as we experience it, our knowledge extends beyond this too, right? So other aspects of our own energy field can be communicating with us to give us information that we need as we're like moving in real time through maybe a difficult lesson, or what we experience as like, oh, this is happening again, like I'm in this situation again. And there's different levels to that, right? Like there's maybe some more banal levels that maybe we don't notice because maybe it's tied in with daily routines or some larger routines that we're a part of. And then there are the more like really obvious, like sometimes really over the top kinds of repetitions that really kind of like stop us in our tracks, and it's just kind of like, really? Really? Like, what? So, I just want you to take a moment and think about what those look like in your life. Like, what is maybe the most recent one you've experienced, if you can bring this to mind, if something comes up for you. Where have you been in, or have you noticed one of these, like, kinds of really over the top kinds of repetitions, like, you couldn't make this up kind of level, like, where did this come from? Like, that's just so uncanny. Or something a little bit more mundane, maybe like it is a situation or a type of relationship dynamic or some thing that seems to happen with your jobs. Like, think about the nature of that kind of repetition, like what feels like it's being repeated, and do you experience that as a specific lesson you're supposed to learn? Without getting reductive, though, you got to be really careful, right? Because we have a lot of sneaky mechanisms for, because we love certainty, right? We love the feeling of like, okay, now I have the answer. And we've got a lot of sneaky forms of psychological bias that will drive us to that feeling. And so it's going to feel like we have this answer, this, we've resolved it, and we've just kind of like done this really easy reduction that, gives us that feeling of relief. And it's not necessarily true. So you have to be really careful about jumping too quickly to like, oh, what this means, what this lesson is. So think about these repetitions for you, and maybe drop this in the comments to let me know where it's resonating, where it's landing with you. And when you're in these moments again, or travel back and imagine this, you know, can you find these moments and start to ask new questions about them? Like, what were you asking about it? What kinds of questions does it raise for you? Just like pause and take a moment to really dig into that. Like, write it down when you really let yourself think about it. Especially if you have like one of these like really over the top examples. What questions are you actually asking? Like, metaphysically, as deep as you can go. And to also learn to like draw on your memory about this, because if it does feel like that kind of repetition, what exactly are you remembering from the previous iteration? Just think about that. Just take a second. What exactly seems like it's repeated? And can you go back to the original experience and ask new questions about that original experience? Okay, so here's the part where I'm going to start to talk about one of the best films I've seen in quite a while. But let's just review again, because we often think about this idea of like learning lessons and these patterns, moving through patterns in this very 3D sense of like we're holding on to something and then we need to release it. Like, can you see the spatial qualities of that? Literally holding and then releasing, right? And sure, we can treat that as a little bit of a metaphor, but it's still, to me, it seems very 3D. Because think about some time when you learned something really quickly, like you got it, like on the first go, and it was kind of like a Satori moment. You didn't have to like hang around in this place of like repeating and repeating and what am I holding on to? What do I have to let go of? Like, you just literally let go of your previous understanding. It wasn't even, it was just so instantaneous. It wasn't even a thing. And so this is what it means to like be on this higher symbolic frequency with what you're experiencing. So there is an element of what feels like speed or temporality in here, because certain truths or certain understandings that you need to reach, there could be a reason that you need to kind of take what feels like a slower trip through that for some reason. And with other things, like I said, it's whether it's Satori or it's just you learn it and there's just, it's pretty basic or it's pretty straightforward or it's life changing even, but it can happen instantaneously. So I just think that's an interesting little gap to think about. Like when you're on a higher frequency and you're processing more within any given moment of your experience, you don't have to like, you're not in this dialogue of like, what am I holding on to? What do I need to release? Like, what is the lesson? Right? You just like get it. There's no lesson. You just get it. Like you're just on to the next thing. Isn't that interesting? So here's where I want to start telling you about the film that I saw. I wonder if yeah, I don't think you could guess it. No, there's just like so much out there right now. But what if it seems like so if certain lessons are taking us longer to move through, it may be that these are linked with our higher purpose in a way that other kinds of lessons just aren't. So there's an element of like complexity and simplicity to this as well, right? But we can still learn very complex things quickly. And it may be that maybe we do it because it's not necessarily linked to our soul purpose or our higher purpose in the same way that other things are, which for some reason we may need to spend more time on, more iterations, more angles. We may need to understand it more thoroughly for a higher reason. Just to take like one really simple example, like from my own childhood, there was a moment where I don't know, maybe I was like 10 or 11. I hadn't had a lot of exposure. Like I played piano, but I hadn't had a lot of exposure to like, for example, guitar at that time. And I could be mixing some of the order of events here, but there was a moment somewhere along the line where like a friend was taking guitar lessons or something, and I just learned one day, like, oh, like the fretboard, there was like such a logic to it. There's like a science, right? Because attaining a certain pitch with these chords is something very scientific. And I mean, I knew that, but like the fretboard, I just didn't understand it. Like there was a moment, right? You can remember the first time you learned certain things. And I was doing a couple other things at the time. And it was like a scene for me, right? Because it was like this moment, it was a threshold. I have a memory of it for some reason, but it was very instantaneous. And then it was just like, oh my goodness, like there's like this whole logic and science behind it. It's absolutely beautiful. So that's an example of like just a really simple kind of thing you can learn. And it may not be something that's like kind of like complex and tied into your own higher purpose, your soul purpose. So think about examples in your own life that might fit with that too, right? Like profound things you learned, but you learned them really quickly, versus things that maybe it feels like you're taking a long time to learn because they're also profound, but they're also linked with your higher purpose for some reason. That could be the part that's making it feel so obscure, right? Because for other people, it's something could be really cut and dry, really black and white, even really like banal, even if it's difficult, right? Like they learn it, they figure it out, they move on with their lives. But you may have like a specific area where for some reason you have to take the long way around. You've got to learn it from all these angles. You've got to learn it inside and out, all the way it falls apart, all the ways it crumbles, all the ways you can put it together. There's a reason. And so before I talk about this film, I just want you to consider, like, make a little note to yourself or drop this in the comments, but think about the most mysterious place in your life where it does feel like something is a repetition and you kind of like reach the same point over and over in different situations, or a specific area of your life seems to kind of work in a certain cycle. Think about what that is. Maybe you've got two really big ones. Make a couple notes on this And I want you to approach it like you are reading a mystery. Like there is something mysterious here. There is more than just the black and white of like what's written on the lines, what's written on the page. There is stuff between the lines. There is a page on the back of that page. There are actually other colors. And I just want you to try to like really dig into that and see what these moments are for you. Again, what else are you remembering? And what new questions can you ask about what you're remembering? What stands out for you and why? Okay. Now, I want to talk about this film. So, this is a Netflix original. It just came out this year. And it's not obviously wholly without precedent. It's drawing on many established conventions in, other genres like action adventure, some sci-fi. And so this is a film directed by Byung-woo Kim, South Korean director, and it's called The Great Flood. Now, if you've seen this, drop a comment. Let me know what you think, what you thought. I thought this was really genius, and not from, a more classically like aesthetic kind of like film cinematic kind of perspective, but even so, as such, this was amazing writing, and Byung-woo Kim also wrote it and directed it. And this is basically about creating a kind of, well, this is an AI researcher who is trying to find a way to kind of, as we would say, complete the emotional engine for humanity so that humanity could continue to survive off planet ostensibly and move further into space. They were creating kinds of like hybrids, AI slash human hybrids. And that's kind of like the surface level that kind of like plugs into our current moment and the fears in our current moment about this and everything. But there's also like different registers to that, right? There's like developmental registers, there's mythological registers, the Great Flood. And it's just fascinating because, so I don't want to try to give like explicit spoilers here, but it was like a popular movie over the holidays, so probably you have watched it if you are on Netflix. But basically, okay, let me just take a second because let me see if I'm gonna have to say some spoilers. Yes, I'm gonna have to share some spoilers here, so spoiler warning. I'm gonna put that in the notes. Pause this and go watch that film if you're already interested in this topic. Just pause this here. You can come back to this video and then drop a comment. Let me know what you think after you watch that film, because I'm even considering hosting like a separate Zoom on this so that we can discuss it. So if there's enough of you and you like would really like to join that call, like put that in the comments too. Subscribe to my channel and get on my list, and then I will organize something like that because there's a lot to talk about in here. So I'm not going to get into all the details about like the way that the simulation is working and this kind of thing, but there's some really interesting levels of recursivity involved within the character's experience as the AI researcher, also within the simulation, and mythologically and allegorically for who we already are as a human collective and what we've already been through. And one of the things that I was really getting after this film is that the way she ended up, like the way she really learned, I mean, there was two things, right? She was like receiving data from her other iterations, but also the way in which like everything had to be brought down to this level of like the survival networks. Like the survival networks had to be activated in order to like learn the lesson, to pull in the other information. She was like pulling it in from memory from the other iteration, and pulling it in from, yeah, she was being fed information as well, right? It wasn't just what she was able to access in 3D. I'm definitely going to have to write about this. It's going to go up on my Substack after I've properly processed everything, but I just wanted to give you like a little really quick sketch so far. But what was happening with her character And you saw the numbers constantly changing on her shirt, right? So she was constantly being like reset. She died and she was reset and dropped back into that particular matrix, and always in like a new survival situation, to in order to activate like the trust network, just receiving the feed basically, which was not from the, let's call it like the engine or the model that she was working with. She still had to receive more. And you can like draw the parallels, right? Like the analogical parallels are really obvious here, even to like what we would experience now in a matrix, but it's not, that type of like simulated matrix. So this is kind of a really interesting recursive allegory at this point, since now we're also literally building these kinds of like artificially intelligent matrices. But something similar happens with us, and the ways that we need to experience a kind of like survival reset, like whether we crash out and we go through a dark night of the soul, or we just have some kind of like, you know, some kind of like more mundane crash out, even where we have to kind of like start over again, and we find ourselves in a similar survival situation. And by that I mean, I'm broadly, where it's kind of like you feel like you have to start from scratch with something again. Something like catastrophic happens and you have to start from scratch. And it's like that type of dynamic, right? That's what they're playing with in this film. And I just feel there's a really interesting parallel here with, we might talk about it in with the concept of like seeding, like kind of like seeding someone an idea, seeding something into a system. Obvious links here with like the amazing film Inception. In our lives as humans, having a kind of like our spiritual nature, our spiritual connection onto more transcendent, transpersonal domains of information, where we might want to use the same concept of like being seeded a particular idea, which doesn't come from our own psychological mind, but we have access to it, right, through our higher intuition, through the access that we have to like this divine beam, really, which is like operating through us when we're in alignment and open. And something which is really funny about me, I don't know if this is a toxic trait, I might change it, but in the past like several years, let's say, I have watched, particular movies, like I watched with my family on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, for example. And for whatever reason, in the last like 5 years or so, maybe they have tended to be, this is a time of their release anyway, right? But kind of like pseudo, like apocalyptic style films, like what's happening with the world, right? Like one year it was like Don't Look Up. And then another year it was a film, the Don DeLillo adaptation. I'm forgetting the title of it. But what is really strange is that for me, it has felt like, oh, whatever I choose, it kind of, something about it manifests in the next month or 2 months. And that may not just be me, because obviously many people are watching these films and these are objective events that are happening. So it's just a question of like, well, who's noticing that, right? And one year, for example, the Don DeLillo adaptation that came out, or it was whatever, big on Netflix when I watched it. Just, it was like 2 months before the that train derailment that happened in Ohio. Well, guess what the plot of that Don DeLillo adaptation is, right? Insane. And and then there was some other aspect too with, oh, what was that last year? The film, it was like co-produced by the Obamas, and it was about, oh, there's a plane crash. Like I'm forgetting all the details, but literally like there were aspects of that became objective news events within the week, basically, or within like by mid-January. Again, really wild. And then last night, was this 2 nights ago? Watching this film, The Flood, The Great Flood. And I was kind of like making a joke about remembering like how I kind of like do these manifestations, and that they kind of, the timeline seems to shrink each year. So anyway, we watched The Great Flood, and in this, what's happening in her building, right? Like it's total disaster, right? Like you've got a flood, the power goes out, the furnaces blast, there's like a gas explosion, all of that. Anyways, the next day, like our power goes completely out for, usually it's back on within an hour. But our power was out for like 6 hours. And there was like a massive ice storm, which was also pretty unusual. Like it's been a really, really, really long time. Really massive ice storm. So yeah, I was just kind of joking about that and how, like, I've got to like choose some different, more positive manifestations maybe. But there is a really interesting allegorical theme in there about the power going out, right? External forms of power being extinguished in this flood or this ice storm, and kind of like forcing a spiritual reset so that you kind of find power within, literally. And I think that what this is speaking to is that, another kind of like um, piece of wisdom we hear a lot about is, not like sourcing things from outside yourself, not looking to the external world, but finding it within instead. And, what about these cases where certain things are kind of like a little bit of both, right? When you think about it, our brain is what's happening in our brain. Is that internal or is that an external thing? Like our brain is literally this external 3D object, but we have this strangely internal relationship with it. And similarly, in the case of this film, to go back to the Great Flood, we're talking about algorithmic models that are serving as someone's mind or brain, and they have been literally programmed from the outside, but they're experienced as internal. And so, similarly, we also can shift the way in which we find guidance from what is like obviously external, like just, not that that's always wrong though. Like some answers we do need to seek in this objective kind of intersubjective register, because of that's where they are produced. But for other things, like just sourcing it externally versus, we may not have access to certain things internally either. But there's a middle place, right, where we can access transpersonal information, for example, through our guides or through some ascended consciousness, some ascended aspect of ourselves. And in some sense, that is it's kind of bridging this internal and the external, right? It's not quite internal because we haven't yet experienced that, but it's also not external to us. So that's quite interesting. And we see that parallel also in The Great Flood, the film, because this AI researcher, of course, is literally the one like feeding back her own memories to her avatar. So she is almost like literally living out iterations of a life as this avatar, and then returning to the ship, which is ostensibly the one that will carry them to a new planet, but of course within the simulation it's a different ship, right? And it's also the place where she will transfer her memories back into her avatar, into the emotional engine. And so we come back to this theme of repetition and the meaning of something being repeated. And so for her, her avatar had to like repeat a certain set of actions, a certain challenge, like many, 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 many times, until certain like trust networks were activated, until certain um, memories were activated, until she started asking different questions, right? So you remember the son was always saying like, why am I still 6 years old? You can see the nature in which it was part of her simulation, like part of her own, the model really that she had access to. And again, that scene really powerful when she was scrolling on her phone finally to look at what he drew, and it was like the same drawing, just different iterations of the drawing over and over and over. Absolutely fascinating, right? Like, let's go back and think about films like Chris Marker, La Jetée. This is the same thing, right? The ship on the dock. Wow. So I really loved this film. There's a lot more detail here, a lot more I'm going to go into. I'm going to try to write about this for my Substack. But I hope that this has been like a useful kind of exploration for you too, like has raised some questions or insights. I would like to hear about your own experiences in the comments. So if you want to drop your answers down below, I will respond to those. And again, if there's enough people who are interested, I'm going to maybe host a Zoom on this too. I'm going to try to watch it again. But yeah, definitely a lot of areas we need to rethink in here. So let me know which parts of this resonated. And thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to you pretty soon.